It started the moment we moved into our new home nestled on the edge of a quiet neighborhood that looked almost too perfect to be true, the kind with neatly trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes, and an eerie silence broken only by the occasional bark of a distant dog. I should have trusted my gut that day, the way the neighbors peered at us from behind their curtains, the way one woman in particular marched across the street before we'd even finished unloading our truck, clipboard in hand, and a forced smile plastered across her face. She introduced herself as Karen, president of the local homeowners association. We didn't know it then, but this woman was about to make our lives a living nightmare. She said, "Welcome to the neighborhood." And before I could even reply, she launched into a rehearsed speech about community guidelines, mandatory dues, and fines for non-compliance. My wife, who stood beside me, looked at her with a raised eyebrow and asked what HOA. We didn't know this area was under any sort of homeowners association. Karen's smile twitched, but she kept her tone pleasant. She said, "Oh well, of course we're a private HOA. You must have missed the packet the realtor was supposed to give you." She clicked her pen and asked for my signature right there, and then I politely declined and told her we weren't interested in joining any association. Karen's entire demeanor changed. She narrowed her eyes and stepped a little closer, as if her proximity might pressure us into signing. She said, "It's not optional. It's required by the community bylaws." My wife calmly replied that we had reviewed the property documents and nowhere did it state mandatory HOA membership. Karen turned a shade redder and muttered something about calling the management board. We moved in anyway, despite her threats, assuming that would be the end of it. We thought maybe she was just overly enthusiastic, or perhaps trying to scare us into compliance. But then strange things started happening. Small at first. Our trash bins were knocked over every morning. Our mailbox got jammed with flyers from the so-called OA warning us about violations like improper window blinds or a lawn that needed more uniformity. We laughed it off at first, but when we started getting actual citations left on our doorstep with fake fines, we realized this woman wasn't letting go. My wife took photos of every incident and logged every note. She was methodical, always had been, especially since she worked for a federal agency. I can't say which one, but let's just say her ID alone carries more weight than most badges people see. Karen didn't know that yet, though she thought we were just another couple she could intimidate about HOA. Week after moving in, we hosted a small barbecue in our backyard. Nothing big, just a few friends, some music, and a grill going. But right in the middle of it, Karen barged into our yard through the side gate without knocking, without announcing herself. She started yelling about noise violations, unsanctioned gatherings, and how we were disrespecting HOA codes. My wife calmly asked her to leave. Karen refused. She even had the audacity to call the local police on us right in front of everyone. When the police arrived, they were clearly confused. They asked what the issue was, and Karen practically demanded they issue citations to us. She said we were ignoring HOA rules, hosting illegal events, and being hostile to the community. The officers turned to us, asked for our IDs, and that's when my wife pulled out her federal identification. The change in Karen's face was instant. The confidence drained from her, as if someone had popped a balloon. She stuttered, asked what agency that was from, and my wife just smiled and told her it was above her pay grade. The officers saw the ID, nodded, and asked if we wanted to press charges for trespassing. We declined for the moment, thinking Karen had finally learned her lesson, but we were wrong. That incident was just the beginning. Karen became obsessed. She began watching our house from her window, jotting things down in a little notebook, following my wife when she walked our dog, and even trying to speak to our guests when they visited, always under the guise of some fake community policy. One evening, we came home to find a large HOA violation notice nailed to our front door. It accused us of harboring illegal structures because of a tool shed in our backyard that had been there for years. Even before we bought the place, we laughed again until the next morning when city code enforcement showed up asking about the structure. Apparently someone had filed a complaint about unpermitted buildings, and guess who? My wife showed them the purchase documents, photos of the shed pre-ownership. and even a written note from the previous owner stating it had been there for over a decade. The officer apologized and left, but not before warning us that the person who filed the complaint had done so multiple times under different aliases. Clearly this wasn't about violations, it was personal. At this point we decided to get proactive. We began researching the HOA Karen claimed to represent. Turns out there was no legal HOA registered for our street. The nearest one was over 3 blocks away, and even that one was voluntary and only covered a handful of homes. We pulled the tax records, the county zoning maps, everything we could find, and confirmed it. Karen was running a fake HOA and trying to impose it on us and our neighbors. That realization led us to knock on some doors. We started talking to other residents who admitted they too had felt pressured by Karen. Many had been paying her monthly fees thinking it was real. Some were too scared to stop, afraid they'd get fined or harassed worse than we had. We told them what we had discovered, and slowly the neighborhood began to wake up. But Karen wasn't done. She escalated even further when she found out we were organizing a neighborhood meeting. She called the police again, this time accusing us of conspiracy to undermine a community organization. When the officers arrived again, they recognized my wife and didn't even bother entertaining Karen's claims. Instead, they took our statements and left with a nod. My wife had had enough. She contacted her agency not to involve them officially, but to get legal advice on handling civilian harassment, especially when it involved false claims and potential impersonation of authority. Within a week we had a lawyer and began drafting a cease and desist letter to Karen, outlining every illegal action she had taken, every fraudulent claim she had made, and the possible charges she could face if she continued. When the letter was delivered, Karen tried to act unfazed, but we could see it in her eyes. She was shaken. Still, she didn't stop. She just changed tactics. Now it was anonymous notes in our mailbox, phone calls from blocked numbers, slashed tires, once even a dead squirrel left on our porch. It was becoming unhinged. The morning after the dead squirrel incident, my wife sat at the dining table, not with fear or anger, but with resolve. She was done playing defense, and I could see it in her eyes. The calm precision that comes from years of training and experience in high-level federal matters. She wasn't going to wait for the next move. She was going to make it. We installed cameras not just around our property, but also placed a few discreet ones facing the street where Karen's house sat, one pointed at our mailbox, another at the side of the yard, and 2 near the driveway. We even set up a trail cam in the bushes, which had a clear line of sight to the gate, just in case she tried to trespass again. That night we didn't sleep. We watched the feeds, and just past midnight we caught her. Karen walked up to our yard in her robe, her hair a mess, her hand holding what looked like a garbage bag. She tiptoed to our porch, opened the flap of the bag, and dumped what turned out to be shredded paper food scraps and something else that looked like raw meat. She glanced around and walked away like nothing had happened, but we had it all on video in perfect clarity. The next day, we filed a report with the local authorities. We handed over the footage and explained everything leading up to that moment. They promised to look into it and even posted a patrol car down the street for a few nights. But even with all that, Karen didn't stop. She turned her focus toward our friends and neighbors. Anyone who visited us became a target. People started receiving notes in their mailboxes about parking violations, bogus zoning complaints, even threats of being reported to code enforcement if they continued associating with us. Some neighbors grew distant, fearful. Others stood by us stronger than before. It is creating a divide in the neighborhood, and we knew we had to end this for good. So we went deeper. My wife and I hired a private investigator to look into Karen's background. We knew she wasn't part of a real HOA, and we suspected she didn't even have the authority she claimed to. But what we found was more than we expected. Karen had a history of filing lawsuits, small claims mostly against neighbors, landlords, even delivery companies, all under the guise of community enforcement or public safety. She had once sued a dog walker for allegedly violating leash laws in a park she didn't even live near, and she had lost every time. We gathered everything into a binder labeled Karen the HOA Karen. We documented every note, every encounter, every bit of footage. We printed public records filed police reports, and a full timeline of her harassment. Then we filed for a restraining order, not just for us, but also for 3 of our neighbors, who had also become her targets. The court date was set, and for the first time since moving in, Karen wasn't the one in control. We saw her that morning dressed in a gray suit, sitting in the back of the courtroom, arms crossed and eyes darting around the room. When the judge called our case, we presented everything, including the footage of her dumping trash on our porch, the letters she had sent, and statements from our neighbors. The judge didn't even let her speak for more than a minute before ordering the restraining order effective immediately. That should have been the end of it, but for people like Karen, it's never that simple. The day after the court order, she stood on the sidewalk across from our house for over an hour just staring. She wasn't on our property, so technically not violating the order, but she wanted us to see her to know she was still watching. My wife took a picture, sent it to the officer assigned to our case, and they paid her a visit the next day. We didn't see her outside again for weeks, but during that silence, something strange happened. We started getting letters from a lawyer addressed to us claiming defamation of character, harassment, and emotional distress. Karen was trying to sue us. Yes, the woman who had harassed us for months was now trying to play the victim. We handed the letter to our own attorney, who responded professionally and clearly stating the facts, along with a reminder of the court order already in place. Karen's lawyer backed off soon after. We figured even they realized the mess they were dealing with. We thought we'd earned peace. We kept our cameras running, just in case, but the attack slowed down significantly until one afternoon when I received a knock on the door. It was a man in a suit and a badge clipped to his belt. He introduced himself as an investigator from the county's Office of Fraud and Enforcement. Apparently, Karen had filed multiple official complaints under a fake organization name, claiming to be president of a registered HOA and collecting funds from residents without proper licensing or any legal standing. He asked if we'd be willing to provide our evidence for their case, and we didn't hesitate. It turns out Karen had been scamming people not just on our street, but in the surrounding blocks too. She was collecting dues, enforcing her made-up rules, and threatening legal action to anyone who didn't comply. Over the years, she had taken thousands of dollars from unsuspecting neighbors, and no one had questioned her because of how convincingly she played the role of HOA president. She had even created fake forms, fake notices, and a website that looked semi-official. The county began building a case against her one by one. Neighbors came forward sharing their experiences. Someone mentioned how they'd been fined for painting their shutters the wrong shade of brown. Another had paid her over $500 in late dues for a fee that never existed. Karen was a fraud, a con artist hiding behind a clipboard and a smile, and now her lies were unraveling. A few weeks later, officers with a warrant searched her home and confiscated boxes of documents, receipts, bank statements, and her laptop. She was taken in for questioning, and we watched from our porch as she was led away in handcuffs. Neighbors whispered from their doorsteps, watching the queen of the fake HOA finally fall from her throne. That wasn't the last we'd hear of her. After the investigation concluded, charges were filed, multiple counts of fraud, impersonation, harassment, and even misuse of public services for all those bogus police calls she had made. The community was stunned, and more people came forward, even those who had been scared to speak up before finally finding the courage once they saw she was no longer in control. We received a formal apology from the county, thanking us for our cooperation and the evidence we had provided. We didn't need the thanks. We were just happy to see justice being done. Over the next few months, the neighborhood began to heal. People started talking again. Barbecues returned to backyards, and there were no more shady notes or surprise visits, just neighbors finally living in peace. The trial date was set for early spring, and by the time it arrived, the entire neighborhood had turned into something of a unified front. People who once kept to themselves now chatted over fences, organized potlucks, and checked in on each other. Almost daily, we had become a community in the real sense, not because of some fake HOA But because we had survived a common enemy and grown stronger because of it, when we showed up to the courthouse that morning, it wasn't just us, our neighbors were there too. Several of them had been subpoenaed to testify, others had volunteered to give statements or submit their evidence, and even those not directly involved came for support. We filled an entire row of benches in that courtroom, shoulder to shoulder, united against the chaos Karen had caused. Karen entered wearing a conservative gray suit, her hair pulled tightly back, her face pale and expressionless. She avoided eye contact with everyone, especially my wife, who sat quietly flipping through her binder full of records. She wasn't nervous, she was focused. And she had every reason to be, because the case against Karen wasn't just strong, it was overwhelming. Prosecution began with a timeline, detailing when Karen first started her fake HOA operations. Years before we had moved in, she had created documents, purchased a PO box for official mailings, set up a website that looked almost real, and started collecting dues from residents, all under the pretense of community management. They brought in a digital forensics expert who testified how the emails and website traffic all traced back to Karen's home IP address, and how the so-called board of directors listed on her website were either fake names or unrelated people who had never lived in the neighborhood. Then came the witnesses one by one. Our neighbors stepped up to the stand and told their stories, how they had paid her money, how they had lived in fear of being fined, or reported how they were harassed by notes and warnings and false accusations. Someone even brought in a box filled with every flyer and letter she had ever sent them going back 3 years. It was a mountain of lies, and it was all laid bare before the court. My wife was called to testify. Midway through the second day, she walked to the stand with quiet confidence and answered every question with the clarity of someone who had spent her career in high-pressure environments. She detailed the incidents of harassment, the police reports, the forged documents, and the final confrontation, where Karen had called the cops only to be humiliated by her federal ID. The courtroom murmured when that story was told, and the judge leaned forward with a raised brow, asking for clarification. "Which agency did you say you worked for?" My wife simply smiled and said that information was classified, but her identification had already been verified through the official chain of custody. Karen's defense lawyer tried to argue that she was simply misunderstood, that she had only been trying to bring order to a disorganized neighborhood, and that maybe she had gone a little too far but meant no harm. The problem was the evidence said otherwise, and no jury would see dumping animal remains on someone's porch or faking citations as harmless. After 5 full days of testimony, the jury left to deliberate and returned in less than 3 hours. They found Karen guilty on multiple counts, including fraud, impersonation, harassment, and illegal solicitation of funds. The judge sentenced her to community service restitution to every family she had stolen from, and 6 months in county jail, not just for the financial crimes, but for repeatedly abusing the legal system and misusing emergency services. She was also banned from any future leadership position in any community organization for life. When the sentence was read, Karen broke down in tears in front of the court. She mumbled something about how she was only trying to keep the neighborhood nice, but no one seemed moved by her tears, especially not the families who had lived under her reign of control and intimidation. We walked out of the courthouse together, dozens of us, and stood in the parking lot for a while, just breathing, just enjoying the weight of closure lifting off our shoulders. Neighbors hugged, exchanged numbers, made plans, and you could feel something shift in that moment. We weren't just neighbors anymore, we were survivors of a bizarre battle. We had come through it stronger and more connected than ever before. In the weeks that followed, the HOA signs Karen had posted around the neighborhood were taken down. We hosted a celebration in our backyard, the same yard where she once stormed in and tried to shut down our barbecue. This time nearly everyone on the street came, even the elderly couple who had previously stayed out of everything brought over a pie and said it was the best night they'd had in years. A real sense of peace settled in that summer. No more suspicious notes, no more threats, no more fake citations. The mailbox stayed clean, the lawn stayed safe, and the neighborhood bloomed in ways it never had before. People repainted their homes, planted flowers, waved at each other, and even formed a real neighborhood watch, not to spy on each other, but to protect what we had built. One of the most unexpected outcomes was how many people started reaching out from nearby communities when the news of the trial made local headlines. Others realized they too had been targeted by fake or overly aggressive HOA leaders. We received emails, messages, and even phone calls from strangers thanking us for standing up and asking how they could organize and push back in their own areas. We shared what we could, offered our documentation, and encouraged them to find their voice. But the story didn't end there, because months later, after Karen had served her time and was quietly living in a small apartment across town, we received a certified letter addressed to both of us. From her, inside was a handwritten apology. A real one, not a legal formality, not a threat or a trick, just a page and a half where she explained how her obsession with control had ruined her life, how she had started the HOA to feel important, and how she had lied to herself for years, convincing herself that she was doing good, even when everything pointed to the opposite. She admitted that seeing my wife's badge had been the moment everything cracked. That she had realized for the first time she wasn't above the rules, she wasn't untouchable, and that she had spent her time in jail thinking about every decision that brought her there. She didn't ask for forgiveness, but she offered the apology anyway, and that alone meant more than we expected. We didn't write back. We didn't need to. Sometimes closure isn't a conversation. It's just a choice to move forward, to live freely, and to not let past shadows steal the light from your present. And that's exactly what we did. We lived, we thrived, and we enjoyed every minute of the peace we had earned the hard way. It had been almost 6 months since Karen was sentenced, and our lives had settled into a calm, steady rhythm. The neighborhood felt alive again. Kids rode their bikes freely. Dogs barked from fenced yards without complaints. Flowers bloomed in front yards, and porch lights twinkled late into the evening. There was laughter during weekend get-togethers, and strangers waving from their front porches. The air felt lighter, like we had all taken a collective deep breath and finally exhaled. My wife spent more time working from home and even began mentoring young professionals in her field through remote sessions, and I picked up small woodworking projects on the side, building benches, mailboxes, and birdhouses for neighbors who requested them. Some paid me with cookies or home-cooked meals, others with fresh vegetables from their gardens. It wasn't about the money, it was about the bonds that were forming, the kind that only grow after surviving chaos together. Then one day a moving truck appeared in front of Karen's old house, and the whole block seemed to stop and stare for a moment. We all wondered who would dare buy the infamous house, the one with the fake HOA history, the one where dozens of lives had been disrupted for years. But the curiosity quickly turned to concern when a familiar face stepped out of the truck. It wasn't Korean, but her younger sister. She looked almost identical in build and posture, except younger, with lighter hair and a more casual air about her. She started waving at people, introducing herself as Tina, and claiming she was just trying to make a new start. She said she had inherited the house from Karen and didn't plan on causing any trouble. She even made jokes about not knowing how to run a fake HOA. The neighborhood was cautious, but polite. We didn't want to judge her based on her sister's actions, but we also weren't ready to let our guard down. For the first few weeks, Tina kept to herself. She repainted the porch, changed the drapes, and planted new flowers in the front garden. Her behavior seemed normal enough, and people began to warm up to her. She brought over muffins to our house once and thanked us for keeping the place clean during her sister's absence. My wife smiled politely and said nothing. We were watching, not judging, but definitely watching. Then came the discovery. One Saturday morning, a neighbor's dog slipped out through a broken fence and ran into the backyard of Tina's place. The dog's owner followed, calling her name, but stopped abruptly when he spotted something near the shed at the back of the property. He came running to our house, visibly shaken, and asked if we could take a look with him. We followed him back, and what we found was shocking. Behind the shed, barely covered by an old tarp, were multiple boxes filled with what appeared to be HOA paperwork, not just the fake citations and notices. Karen used to hand out but personal files on nearly every resident on the street. Full names, schedules, copies of license plates, surveillance photos, even payment logs. It was a full-blown operation, and it looked like Karen had kept records on everyone, far more detailed than anyone imagined. My wife called the police immediately. They arrived within the hour, sealed the area, and began collecting the boxes for evidence. It turned out Karen hadn't just been writing notes. She had created a full database on her neighbors, complete with behavioral patterns, vehicle movements, and even overheard conversations. It felt invasive, chilling, like we had all been under surveillance without knowing for years. Tina stood off to the side, arms folded, mouth covered in disbelief. She claimed she had no idea what her sister had been doing, that she had only moved in to get a fresh start and had never looked behind the shed. She offered to cooperate and even turned over Karen's old laptop, which she had found but never used. The officers thanked her and continued their work. But something about her story felt a little too convenient. Police confirmed later that the files were extensive, possibly tied to other investigations in nearby neighborhoods where similar fake HOA complaints had been reported. Karen might have been working in a wider circle than anyone knew, and there was a chance she had collaborators, or at least copycats inspired by her tactics. They advised us to stay alert and report anything suspicious immediately. From that moment, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted again, not with fear, but with sharper awareness. Neighbors installed more cameras, upgraded locks, and checked on each other more frequently. Some organized regular safety walks in the evenings. Others created a private group chat where we could share updates, questions, or simply ask if anyone had seen a suspicious vehicle go by. It wasn't paranoia. It was protection built on hard-earned lessons. Despite the strange discovery, life went on. Tina remained quiet after the investigation and eventually moved out, claiming she didn't feel safe or welcome anymore. The house went back on the market, and this time it was purchased by a retired couple looking for peace and gardening space. They were kind, sweet, and immediately loved by everyone. Within a week of moving in, they had hosted a porch coffee morning and planted sunflowers along the front walkway. It was the first time anyone had truly smiled in front of that house in years. As for Karen, she served her sentence and faded from public life. No social media, no contact, no return to the neighborhood. Her apology letter remained tucked away in a drawer, unread. Since the day we received it, we had no interest in reopening that chapter, but we didn't forget the lessons we learned from her presence. How power unchecked can rot into obsession. How fake authority can become a weapon, and how silence from a community can feed the control of someone with dark intentions. So we promised never to go quiet again. My wife eventually spoke at a community leadership forum, sharing our experience in a closed session designed to help neighborhoods spot the warning signs of fraudulent HOA activity. She talked about documentation, digital trails, and the importance of knowing your rights. Her talk was well received and even led to changes in how some local municipalities verified HOA registrations and enforced neighborhood regulations. It felt good to turn something awful into something useful. To know that our pain had a purpose beyond just our own peace of mind. We had started in chaos and ended in calm, and somewhere along the way we helped other people avoid the same trap we fell into. After the second investigation wrapped up and the files from Karen's backyard were officially removed as evidence, the neighborhood slowly began to breathe. Again, the feeling of being watched finally started to fade, but it didn't disappear completely. Trust once broken doesn't mend overnight, especially not when your sense of safety had been quietly eroded for years under the surface. We were healing, yes, but it was going to take time. The city officials sent out a formal statement thanking the residents of our neighborhood for their cooperation and patience during what they called a rare but serious breach of public trust. They explained how Karen's actions had triggered policy discussions at multiple levels about how HOA structures were regulated and monitored, and they promised future safeguards to ensure something like this couldn't happen again, at least not so easily. Some of our neighbors who had once been silent now stepped forward to become voices of Strength: one elderly man who had lived on the street for over 30 years and never attended a single meeting became the unofficial historian of the block. He shared stories from the early days before HOAs even existed and reminded everyone that the true spirit of a neighborhood came from people, not rules, not forms, not dues. We started organizing actual events, real ones. This time hosted by people, not run by fear or manipulation. We held garage sales together, shared tools, swapped garden supplies, and even started a small lending library using an old mailbox near the community garden. People left books and little notes for each other, sometimes just a smiley face or a quote, or even baked goods in Ziploc bags. The block began to feel like home for real. Then one day we received a letter, not from Karen, not from Tina, not from the county, not even from someone we knew. It was addressed simply to the couple who stood their ground. Inside was a handwritten note with no return address, no name, and no signature. The writing was neat, deliberate, and the tone surprisingly emotional. The writer claimed to have known Karen from a long time ago, someone from her early life, possibly even her college days. They explained that Karen hadn't always been like that. She was once bright, driven, full of energy, and passionate about community work. But something had changed after she was passed over for a major leadership position in a nonprofit group she had volunteered at for years. According to the letter, she had been humiliated, publicly made to feel invisible despite all the effort she put in. And it had broken something inside her. That was when she started shifting, becoming more controlling, needing authority, and seeking it wherever she could. The letter continued, explaining how Karen had slowly developed this obsession with rules and order, not because she hated people, but because she felt people would never respect her unless she could force them to. She believed that only by creating structure, even fake structure, could she regain control of her life and the people around her. She convinced herself that if she could manage a community, maybe one day people would finally see her as the leader she thought she deserved. Debate was a sad letter, not one that excused her actions, but one that offered context. It ended with a quiet plea that if we ever spoke publicly again about the situation, that we remember Karen was a broken person, not just a bad one, that her fall from grace was real, but that it started with disappointment and spiraled into delusion. We sat with that letter for hours. It stirred up emotions we hadn't expected. We had every reason to hate her, to be angry and stay angry, but reading about the possible roots of her behavior made things more complicated. It didn't change what she did or the damage she caused, but it made us think about how easily bitterness can grow in silence, how rejection can warp into obsession when no one steps in to help. My wife said something I'll never forget. She said, broken people don't have to become villains, but if they do, someone should still try to understand how they got there, maybe not to save them, but to make sure no one else ends up the same way. And that became something of a mantra for us, not just with Karen, but with others around us as well. When someone lashed out, acted distant or abrasive, we didn't just respond with defensiveness. We asked what might be behind it, and often the answer surprised us. Months passed and the seasons changed again, and the house that once belonged to Karen was now completely transformed, not just by the new owners, but by the energy around it. Children played tag in the front yard, neighbors sat on its porch during cookouts, and sometimes when I walked past it, I could hardly remember what it used to represent. It was just a house again, no more, no less. People often ask what we would have done differently if we could go back. The truth is, I don't think we would have changed much. We didn't start the conflict, but we stood firm when it came to our peace. We didn't retaliate, we documented. We didn't escalate, we educated. We didn't seek revenge, we sought resolution. And because of that, not only did our neighborhood grow stronger, but we helped spark changes far beyond our little street. We were later invited to a regional meeting of neighborhood advocates and city planners who had heard about our story through local reports and word of mouth. My wife gave another talk, this time with real policymakers in the room, and I shared our timeline, our documentation, and how we had turned fear into action. People listened and took notes. Some even thanked us afterward, and said they planned to introduce new legislation in their cities based on what we had experienced. By the end of that year, we had become more than survivors. We had become voices and examples, and while we never asked for that role, we accepted it because we knew how many others might be silently suffering under similar control, afraid to speak up, confused by fake authority, or unsure how to defend themselves from someone like Karen. The truth is, HOA abuse can happen anywhere. In neighborhoods with real associations and ones without, all it takes is one person hungry for control and too few people willing to question their legitimacy. But we learned that questioning is power, asking for proof is protection, and staying silent is the biggest mistake anyone can make in the face of manipulation. As word of our situation spread, it became clear that what we went through wasn't isolated. More and more neighborhoods reached out to us, some by email, some through social media, some even in person. They shared similar experiences, different faces. Same pattern: self-appointed authority, fabricated rules, threats of enforcement, and entire communities being manipulated by a single person who knew just enough about the law to twist it. One couple from 3 states away told us about a woman in their cul-de-sac who claimed she was collecting emergency preparedness donations for the HOA, but no one could verify where the money was going. Another man said his neighbor was forging signatures to get speed bumps installed and then claiming anyone who opposed them was against child safety. It was a disturbing pattern, and it stretched far beyond what we imagined. My wife, being who she was, began to organize everything. She built a map with pins for every case that came in and kept detailed records. She noticed that most of these fake HOA incidents had something in common. They all started small: a friendly warning, a helpful reminder, a clipboard, and a smile. Then slowly the tactics escalated. Just like Karen had done, the illusion of authority was enough to create real fear. She began talking with a group of legal advocates who specialized in HOA law and community regulation. Together, they proposed a small but powerful solution: a public registry of legitimate HOAs, something people could check before ever signing anything or giving anyone money. They pitched the idea to local governments, and within months, the first digital pilot registry launched in our state, searchable and clear, showing which neighborhoods had formal registered HOAs and which did not. It was a game changer, and the feedback was instant. People started printing their own checks, looking up their blocks and realizing that what they thought was official wasn't. And even more importantly, city officials began cracking down on those who were using HOA language to push personal agendas without legal authority. At the same time, my wife received a tip from a contact in her agency, a quiet message asking her to take a closer look at a few details from Karen's past, not from the neighborhood, not from the fraud charges, but from her employment history. We were both confused. Karen had never claimed to work for any agency, and we assumed she had no formal authority at all. But the lead was specific, and it pointed to something strange. Using legal channels and access through her position, my wife was able to confirm that Karen had once applied for a low-level position in a community outreach office, part of a federal housing program. She wasn't hired, but the record showed she had gone through the full application process, attended 2 rounds of interviews, and even taken part in a group training session meant for accepted candidates. But at the last minute, her background check raised a few red flags and the offer was pulled. My wife kept digging and discovered that after being denied, Karen had continued to reach out to employees in that office, pretending she had been hired anyway. She even attended unofficial functions, acting like she was on the inside for a few months before people caught on and blocked her from further access. It was bizarre and unsettling, and it meant one thing: Karen had been trying to get close to real authority long before she created her fake HOA. Explained a lot, not just her obsession with control, but the way she knew how to word things, how to present herself, how to make documents look legitimate. She had studied real systems closely enough to mimic them, and that was what made her so dangerous. She wasn't just power hungry, she was methodical. We shared the findings with the local investigator assigned to her fraud case. He thanked us and passed it along to a federal agency, who had already flagged similar behavior in other parts of the country. They said there was no formal link between Karen and those other incidents yet, but they were beginning to see a pattern of individuals impersonating HOA or community authority and exploiting the trust that came with it. At this point, the story had grown far beyond us. Our neighborhood had become a case study for preventing fraud and manipulation in residential communities, and we were being asked to share our story in larger and larger circles, regional conferences, legal seminars, even virtual roundtables with policymakers and nonprofit organizations. My wife became the face of the movement, not because she wanted it, but because she had lived it and people listened. When she spoke, she created a small guide called Know Your Neighborhood, printed copies, handed them out freely, and posted a downloadable version online. It walked people through how to check if an HOA was real, what red flags to watch for, how to report suspicious activity, and most importantly, how to support neighbors who might be isolated or afraid of speaking out. The guide went viral within a few weeks. It had been downloaded thousands of times and translated into 3 languages by volunteers we had never even met. I started receiving messages too, not just from victims, but from people who admitted they had once been like Karen, not to the same extreme, but close people who had taken advantage of their neighbors, who had used fear and fake titles to get their way and now wanted to make amends or change course. Some apologized, some asked how they could help, and some just shared their story quietly, hoping that someone finally understood what led them there. It was strange hearing those voices, people who had caused pain but who were now searching for redemption. And while not all of them deserved sympathy, it reminded us that behind every villain, there's usually a long line of bad decisions, scars, and missed chances. We weren't responsible for saving them, but we could help others avoid becoming them. One afternoon while sorting mail, I noticed an envelope without a return address again. This time it was typed, not handwritten, and inside was a single line of text. It said, "You stopped her before she became worse. Thank you." That was it. No name, no clue, just those words. I showed it to my wife, and we sat in silence for a while trying to process what it meant. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe someone we never met. Maybe even someone Karen had hurt more deeply than we knew. Whoever it was, they had said something that we hadn't allowed ourselves to consider, that maybe Karen hadn't reached the peak of her destructiveness. Maybe if we hadn't stood up when we did, she would have gone further, taken more money, hurt more people, dragged more families into fear and conflict. Maybe we really had stopped something before it got worse, and that thought filled us with both sadness and pride, because it meant our battle hadn't just been for us, it had protected others too. We thought the story was finally over, but we were wrong, because when a regional journalist stumbled across the guide my wife had created and the case file that had gone semi-public after Karen's sentencing, the story took on a life of its own. It started with a small article in a state-level digital magazine focused on community safety and neighborhood justice. It included quotes from our interviews, some photos of the guide, and even a map of the affected streets. Before we knew it, the piece had been picked up by larger outlets, first local television, then national blogs, and eventually daytime news segments. Suddenly, our story wasn't just a neighborhood warning, it had become a symbol of what could go wrong when unchecked power creeps into ordinary life. Media outlets gave it names like the fake HOA Queen, the clipboard tyrant, and the suburban enforcer. But the one that stuck was simply the Karen case. Not our favorite nickname, but it spread quickly, and soon people around the country were referencing it as a cautionary tale during town halls and city meetings. Our inboxes exploded, people reaching out from all over, asking questions, thanking us, sharing their own stories, or simply wanting to learn more. Some were HOAs trying to clean up their reputation. Others were just homeowners finally realizing they'd been manipulated by someone who wasn't even authorized to speak on behalf of their neighborhood. The attention was overwhelming but meaningful, because it meant people were paying attention and change was being sparked. We were invited to appear on a major morning show to talk About what happened, we hesitated at first, wondering if it would just turn into another media frenzy, but after some discussion, we agreed not for attention, not for publicity, but to make sure that people truly understood what happened and what they could do if something similar was happening in their own neighborhoods. The interview was calm, respectful, and surprisingly powerful. They asked smart questions. My wife explained everything from the fake HOA documents to the legal process to how the community rebuilt afterward. And I shared the emotional side, what it felt like to have your peace stolen by someone who seemed untouchable, and how important it was to speak up even when it feels like no one will believe you. When the episode aired, the reaction was immediate. The guide downloads tripled, donations poured in for the community outreach group we helped establish, and several lawmakers contacted us afterward to discuss how they could introduce better checks on community enforcement structures. It wasn't just noise, it was momentum, and we were proud to see it take shape. And then, just when we thought we'd fully moved on, something happened that pulled it all back. Eni was at the hardware store picking up supplies for a neighbor's shed when I turned a corner and froze. Karen was standing there right in front of me, holding a small planter and staring at a shelf of birdseed. She looked different, smaller, older, maybe more tired than I remembered. She didn't notice me at first, but when she turned and saw me, our eyes met, and the silence that passed between us felt heavy. She didn't run. She didn't say anything, not at first. She just stared, as if trying to gauge whether I'd yell or call someone, or maybe just walk away, but I didn't do any of that. I just stood there, heart thudding, not with fear, but with curiosity. After a long pause, she finally spoke. She said, "I didn't think you'd recognize me." I nodded and said, "How could I forget?" She gave a sad kind of smile and said, "I read the articles. I know what people say about me, and I deserve most of it, but not all of it." She looked down at her hands and added, "I really thought I was helping them, keeping the neighborhood clean, safe, organized. That's what I told myself anyway, even when I knew I'd gone too far." I asked why she pushed so hard for control, why she couldn't stop. Even when people asked her to, her voice was quiet. When she answered, "Because I didn't have anything else. Because when I lost my job, when my family stopped talking to me, when I couldn't fix anything in my life, I thought maybe I could fix a neighborhood. That if people had to listen to me, maybe I wouldn't feel so invisible anymore." It wasn't an excuse, it wasn't redemption, but it was human, and that made it harder. She told me she was in counseling now, part of a program connected to her release term. She said she wasn't allowed to take part in any housing-related groups or activities, and that she had moved far enough away to avoid any temptation to interfere. Again, she said she just wanted to buy a few plants for her window and get back to her apartment where she lived alone and tried not to cause trouble. I told her I hoped she was serious and that people were watching. She nodded and said, "I know they should be." Then she turned, walked away, and that was it. No big apology, no closure, just a brief moment of recognition between two people whose lives had collided in a way neither could forget. I didn't tell my wife right away. I needed time to think about how I felt, and when I finally did, she just listened quietly and then said, "I hope she finds peace, but we earned ours, and we're not giving it up for anyone." Those words stuck with me because they were true. We had rebuilt our lives brick by brick, word by word, trust by trust, and no matter what Karen did with her second chance, we were going to protect what we built. The news died down eventually. As stories do, the media moved on to the next headline. The interviews stopped, the emails slowed, and life returned to what it had been before, peaceful, steady, full of purpose and connection. But the lessons never left us, and the community never forgot. We still kept copies of every document, every screenshot, every video, and every letter, not because we feared she'd return, but because we promised ourselves we'd never let our guard down again, and we'd be ready to help anyone else who needed a hand or a voice or a reminder that they weren't alone. After that unexpected encounter with Karen, things truly began to settle for good. The neighborhood had returned to a peaceful rhythm, the kind of peace that feels earned, not handed to you. The gardens were full of color, the sidewalks filled with laughter, the air calm and safe. We no longer looked over our shoulders or flinched when a letter showed up in the mailbox. We lived without the shadow of control hanging over us, and it felt like freedom, but peace doesn't mean forgetting, it means choosing to carry the past with strength instead of fear, and that's what our neighborhood had done. We didn't bury the history, we grew from it. We took what we'd learned and turned it into something good, into something lasting. That spring, we held the first ever Neighborhood Unity Festival. It wasn't fancy, just lawn chairs, fold-out tables, barbecue pits, and music blasting from a few speakers. Kids ran around with water balloons while adults swapped stories and laughed about things they never used to talk about out loud. It was the kind of day that made everything worth it, and standing in the middle of all of it was my wife, clipboard in hand, but this time with a real purpose. She wasn't enforcing, she was organizing. Officially started a neighborhood alliance, a voluntary group, built not on fear or fines, but on trust, support, and communication. No dues, no punishments, just a group of people looking out for each other. We held monthly gatherings, not meetings. We shared updates, but also recipes, tools, resources, and even job postings for teens looking for weekend work. It was a true community effort, and for the first time in years, everyone showed up because they wanted to, not because they were told to. And then something happened that none of us expected. We received a package, no sender, no markings, just left on our porch in a plain brown box. Inside were two things: an old hard drive and a typed note. The note was short. It read, "This belonged to her. Thought you should have it. Maybe there's something inside that helps you understand or helps someone else." No name, no clue who left it, just that. We plugged in the drive with caution, scanned it, and found dozens of files. Most were drafts of HOA documents, fake rules, templates, spreadsheets with tracking logs and notes about the residents of our street. There were surveillance photos, timestamps, even notations like "yard too messy, warn again," or "dog barks too much, site owner." But mixed in were personal documents, photos from Karen's childhood scanned, journal pages, and even emails she had written to herself, like letters she never sent. Some were angry, others sounded lost. One simply read, "Why won't anyone listen to me? I just want them to see I'm trying." My wife and I sat in silence, going through them, unsure what we felt. It was disturbing and sad and deeply human, all at once. It didn't excuse anything, but it showed just how broken she had become over time. We debated whether to hand it over to authorities or keep it, but in the end we archived it safely, not to use against her, not to shame her, but because history matters, even the ugly parts, even the parts that hurt. The discovery shook us for a while, not in fear, but in reflection. We talked about how someone like her could have been saved or stopped earlier, what systems failed her, what red flags people missed, and how we could prevent others from spiraling into that same need for control disguised as community leadership. It was a heavy conversation, but an important one. We included what we learned from the hard drive into the next version of the Know Your Neighborhood Guide, this time with a new chapter written by my wife called "When Leadership Turns into Control." It talked about the warning signs of abuse of power, not just in HOAs, but in schools, local clubs, church groups, anywhere people gather and give someone a title without accountability. We also launched a small workshop series, both virtual and in person, partnering with local governments and housing organizations to help train residents in spotting manipulation, using proper reporting channels, and empowering quiet voices to speak up. We weren't just healing our own street, we were helping others do the same. One of the most moving moments came at the end of summer, when a single mom from 2 towns over came to one of our events and shared that because of our story, she had finally pushed back against a so-called HOA leader who was threatening her with fake fees and intimidation. She stood up, gathered her neighbors, filed a report, and watched him back down. Within days, she said, our story gave her the courage to believe that she wasn't powerless, and she thanked us with tears in her eyes and a plate of homemade cookies. That moment reminded me of something my wife had said months before: people don't need to be rescued, they just need to know they're not alone. And that's exactly what this journey had become. Not just about stopping Karen, not just about reclaiming our peace, but about making sure no one else felt alone when the rules felt rigged and the voices felt small. We went on to help several other neighborhoods start their own alliances, shared our documents freely, held open Q&A nights, and continued publishing updates whenever new legislation or tools became available for community safety. What started as a nightmare had turned into a movement, and the ripple effects were still growing, and through it all the neighborhood held together better than ever. People painted murals on their fences, built community gardens, turned empty plots into play spaces for kids, and organized cleanup days, not because of rules, but because they cared, because they finally saw the value in each other. The neighborhood was finally thriving, not just recovering, not just stable, but alive in a way it had never been before. Front yards were filled with color, laughter echoed down the street from kids playing in sprinklers, and the sound of neighbors sharing stories over fences had become the new norm. People who once stayed behind closed doors were now part of a community that actually meant something, not built on fear or fake rules, but on trust, effort, and shared experience. Even the house that once belonged to Karen had transformed completely. The retired couple who bought it poured their hearts into making it a home. They added a new paint job, hung wind chimes on the porch, and planted a massive vegetable garden in the backyard. They hosted weekend coffee mornings and even organized a small art walk with local kids, painting colorful stones to line the sidewalk. It was a total rebirth, but even with all the beauty and peace, there was still a quiet thread running underneath. The knowledge that it had all come from something dark, something that had nearly torn us apart, and it was that thread that tied everyone together, not in trauma, but in resilience. Then one morning a letter arrived. This time, it wasn't anonymous or vague. It was from Karen, directly handwritten, signed, and sent with a return address. No tricks, no legal jargon, no fake titles. Just her real name and her real words. The envelope sat on the table for a while, unopened. Part of us didn't want to read it. The other part needed to know what she had to say after everything that had happened. When we finally opened it, we were surprised by the tone. It wasn't dramatic or manipulative. It was simple, straightforward, and almost painfully honest. She said she had been watching from afar, not physically, but through the news, the updates, the media coverage, the guide, the workshops, and she said she never expected anything she did to lead to something so big. She wrote that she had spent months in counseling and community service, truly reflecting, not because she had to, but because for the first time she wanted to. Admitted she had become someone she didn't recognize, and that the worst part was realizing how many people she had hurt. People she'd never meant to see as enemies, but ended up treating like obstacles to control. She wrote that her obsession with order came from a deep need to be seen, to matter, to feel safe in a world that made her feel invisible. But she said she now understood that real safety doesn't come from controlling others. It comes from connection and from earning trust, not demanding it. She didn't ask for forgiveness, but she said if anything good had come from her mistakes, then maybe her fall had some kind of meaning. And the last line of her letter simply said, "I hope you keep building what I couldn't, not for me, but for them, for everyone else who needs it." We didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. We had already moved forward, but the letter did something we didn't expect. It brought closure, real closure, not from an apology, not from justice, not from revenge, but from the knowledge that even someone like Karen could reach a point of self-awareness, even if it came too late. And maybe that was the final chapter we needed. Not a dramatic ending, not a full circle of redemption, but a quiet understanding that people are complicated, that pain can twist into power, and that healing is rarely clean or simple. As the weeks went on, our neighborhood continued to flourish. New families moved in, drawn by the story of unity and the reputation we had built. People came not just to live in a house, but to be part of something, to contribute to a place where their voice mattered, where no one was above the others, where leadership meant service, not control. One evening, we hosted a block dinner. Tables lined the street. Candles flickered in jars, and music floated gently through the air. Someone brought a projector, and we showed photos from the past 2 years. The barbecues, the cleanup days, the art walks, and the Unity Festival. People smiled, laughed, even cried a little. It was more than just nostalgia. It was proof of what we had survived and what we had built. My wife stood up at the end of the night and shared something that stayed with me forever. She said, "We don't remember the pain because it Was easy, we remember it, because it taught us how strong we really are, and we don't honor the struggle by forgetting it. We honor it by making sure no one has to face it alone. Again, her words rang out over the street, and everyone stood together. Not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. And in that moment, everything felt full, not perfect. Not flawless, but full of purpose, heart, and the kind of connection that no fake HOA or forged rule could ever create. The final piece of this journey wasn't a courtroom victory or a media appearance or even Karen's letter. It was something much simpler, something that crept in quietly and made itself known in everyday moments. The way neighbors greeted each other by name now, the way front porches had chairs, not just decorations, the way kids felt free to run, laugh, explore without worry, and the way silence was no longer something we feared, but something we used to reflect and appreciate. We had come so far from the day Karen stood on our porch with that clipboard, trying to enforce power she didn't have, trying to create fear she couldn't sustain, trying to isolate people through paper threats and whispered rules. And yet from that mess, we had grown into a place that thrived, not in spite of what happened, but because we chose to face it head on. What started as a fight for our rights became a movement for others. It taught us that standing firm isn't just about saying no, it's about saying yes to truth, yes to integrity, yes to community and real connection. Our story became part of a growing effort across the country to expose HOA abuse, misuse of authority, and silent manipulation. More cities adopted the guide my wife created and started issuing official neighborhood awareness packets to new homeowners. Neighborhood alliances started popping up with real support and real resources, and people everywhere were realizing they had a voice even when someone tried to drown it out with fake rules and legal jargon. One of the most powerful moments came at a statewide summit where my wife was asked to be the keynote speaker. She stood on that stage with confidence, not because she sought power, but because she had earned trust. She told our story, the real story, not just about Karen, but about how every neighborhood is full of potential, full of people waiting for someone to speak up, and how sometimes change starts with one person refusing to be silent anymore. She ended that speech with words that brought the entire room to its feet. She said, "You don't need a badge to protect your neighborhood. You need courage and community, and the belief that no one is too small to stand tall." From that moment on, our lives shifted again, not back to normal, but into something better. We became mentors to other neighborhoods, helped launch initiatives, and even worked with schools to teach students about leadership, respect, and the difference between influence and control. And as for the house that started it all, the one that once echoed with false power and quiet fear, it stood tall now, covered in ivy and sunflowers, its porch always open, its yard full of laughter. It had become a symbol of transformation, not just for us, but for everyone who knew what had happened there. Karen faded into the background as we expected. She would, her story still whispered in circles, still referenced in training sessions and articles, but no longer feared, just understood. She had become a lesson, not a legend, and that was enough. We never forgot the early days, the fear, the confusion, the anger, but we also never let them define us. Instead, we let them remind us of what we had to lose and what we had the strength to reclaim. Our neighborhood now holds an annual gathering every fall called the Stand Together Night. It's a celebration of everything we built: food, music, laughter, and a moment of quiet reflection, where everyone lights a small candle, not to remember Karen, not to remember the pain, but to remember the strength of a voice that wouldn't back down, and the unity that followed after. And in that flickering light, in those shared stories and handshakes and promises passed between neighbors, we know one thing for certain: we were never just a block on a map, never just a set of houses lined in a row. We were and are a community strong enough to stand, smart enough to question, and united enough to never let fear wear a fake badge again. That is the legacy, not of Karen, but of everyone who said enough is enough, who refused silence, who refused control, who chose connection over compliance, and built something real. And that is how one clipboard, one confrontation, one fake rule turned into a Movement that reminded the world you do not have to obey to belong. You only have to stand and speak, and we did, and now others do too.